There is a number that tells you almost everything you need to know about the G7 summit that just ended in France. The number is 6. 6 formal bilateral meetings that Donald Trump held with other world leaders over the course of the summit. The British Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor, the Japanese Prime Minister, the Italian Prime Minister, the President of the European Commission. 6 conversations, 6 sets of communiques, 6 rounds of handshakes for the cameras. Canada was not one of them. Think about what that means for a moment. Canada shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. Canada and the United States are each other's largest trading partners. The agreement that governs over $1 trillion in annual North American commerce, CUSMA, is currently under renegotiation, with Washington pushing for annual review mechanisms that would give American negotiators permanent leverage over Canadian market access. The two countries are bound by NATO, by NORAD, by 5 decades of defense cooperation, and by a supply chain so deeply integrated that you cannot build an American car without Canadian steel, and you cannot heat a Minnesota home without Canadian natural gas. And at the most consequential gathering of allied leaders of the year, the heads of government of these two countries did not sit down for a formal bilateral meeting. Most coverage treated that as a scheduling footnote. The official language from both sides was careful and vague. Informal contacts, corridor conversations, nothing to read into it. That is the official framing. The operational reality tells a different story. And to understand what actually happened at this G7, you need to look not at the meeting that did not happen, but at the 3 meetings that did. Because while Washington was generating uncertainty, Ottawa was generating agreements. Here is what actually happened. On the margins of the Evian-les-Bains summit, the Canadian government announced a critical minerals agreement with Germany. On the surface, that sounds like a technical arrangement between 2 economies that share an interest in clean energy supply chains. It is considerably more than that. Germany is Europe's largest economy and its most industrially complex. Its automotive sector, which is the backbone of its export earnings, is in the middle of a painful transition from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. That transition requires enormous quantities of specific materials: lithium for batteries, cobalt for cathodes, nickel for anodes, copper for wiring, rare earth elements for motors, and permanent magnets. Germany does not have these materials in meaningful quantities. China does, and for years, China has been the dominant supplier of processed critical minerals to European manufacturers. The agreement signed at the G7 is a direct challenge to that dependency. Canada has all of these materials in abundance. The Canadian Shield, the ancient geological formation that underlies most of northern Ontario, Quebec, and the eastern prairies, is one of the most mineral-rich territories on Earth. What Canada has lacked until recently is the processing infrastructure and the customer relationships to monetize that abundance on its own terms. The German agreement begins to build both. And here is the piece that the standard trade coverage misses. Germany is not just a customer. Germany is a gateway. A Canadian company that establishes itself in the German critical minerals supply chain has effectively established itself in the supply chains of every major European manufacturer that sources components through Germany. The agreement is bilateral in name. Its effects are continental in scope. Now, hold that against what was happening with Washington at exactly the same moment. Trump, in the days surrounding the G7, made multiple public statements about CUSMA that pointed in different directions simultaneously. At various points, he suggested the agreement was working well, that it needed fundamental renegotiation, that Canada was not treating the United States fairly, and that a deal could be reached quickly. Those are not 4 positions on a spectrum. They are 4 mutually contradictory signals, each one designed to keep the other side off balance, none of them constituting an actual negotiating position that Ottawa could respond to substantively. This is the environment in which the bilateral meeting did not happen. And understanding that environment is the key to understanding why the missing meeting is not evidence of a diplomatic breakdown. It is evidence of a deliberate strategic calculation. When your largest trading partner is publicly contradicting itself about the future of your shared trade agreement, sitting down for a formal bilateral meeting creates a problem. Whatever you agree to in the room, the other side can walk back by the time the cameras are set up outside. Whatever you refuse to agree to becomes a public grievance that gets amplified on social media before the handshake photographs have been processed. A formal bilateral with Trump under these conditions is not a negotiating opportunity. It is a liability. The Canadian calculation, and you can see it in the careful language Carney's office has used throughout this period, was that the cost of a contentious or inconclusive formal meeting was higher than the cost of no meeting at all. Informal contacts maintained the relationship. The absence of a formal session denied the other side a stage. But the second agreement signed at the G7 is the one that received the least coverage and deserves the most attention. Canada and India signed a General Security of Information Agreement, known by the abbreviation GSOIA. The name is bureaucratic enough that most outlets that mentioned it at all treated it as a procedural milestone, rather than a strategic event. That framing is exactly wrong. A GSOIA is a formal legal framework that allows two countries to share classified intelligence and sensitive military information with each other. It governs the handling, storage, transmission, and protection of information that is too sensitive to share through ordinary diplomatic channels. You do not sign a GSOIA as a courtesy gesture. You sign it because you have information you want to share, and you need a legal architecture to share it through safely. Canada and India signing this agreement at the G7 signals that the two countries are moving toward a level of defense and intelligence cooperation that requires classified information to flow between them regularly. That is a qualitatively different kind of relationship from the trade and investment partnerships that have dominated the Canada-India conversation for the past decade. Think about the timing. India is the world's most populous country and one of its fastest-growing major economies. It is strategically positioned between China to the east and the Persian Gulf to the west. It has historically pursued a foreign policy of non-alignment, refusing to lock itself into any single great power's orbit. Its relationship with Russia has been complicated by the war in Ukraine, where India has continued to purchase Russian energy, despite Western pressure to stop. And in recent months, India has been quietly but systematically deepening its defense and technology relationships with Western partners, without formally joining any of the alliances those partners belong to. The GSOIA with Canada is one piece of that pattern. It gives India a secure channel for sharing sensitive information with a G7 member without committing to the full weight of a formal military alliance. And it gives Canada a formal intelligence relationship with a country that sits at the intersection of every major geopolitical stress point of the coming decade. And then there are the sanctions. On the margins of the same summit, Carney announced new Canadian measures targeting Russia's shadow fleet, its energy revenues, and its defense industrial base. The package covered 162 individuals, institutions, and vessels. This is not the first round of Canadian sanctions against Russia, and it will not be the last. But the specific targeting of the shadow fleet is worth pausing on. The shadow fleet is the network of aging tankers, often registered under flags of convenience, that Russia uses to move its oil to buyers in Asia and the Middle East, in defiance of Western price caps and sanctions. Disrupting that fleet does not require military action. It requires legal coordination between governments that can identify the vessels, track their movements, and sanction the financial institutions that facilitate their operations. Canada's sanctions package contributes to that coordination, and it signals, at a moment when Trump's own relationship with Western sanctions architecture is unpredictable, that Canada's commitment to the Ukraine support coalition is not contingent on American consistency. Now step back and see the shape of all of this together. At a summit designed to project allied unity around a set of shared priorities, Canada arrived with a specific agenda that had almost nothing to do with managing its relationship with the host country's most powerful participant. Germany got a critical minerals framework that begins to redirect European industrial supply chains away from Chinese dependency. India got an intelligence-sharing architecture that deepens its integration with the Western defense community without requiring formal alliance membership. The Ukraine coalition got a sanctions package that demonstrates Canada's continued commitment regardless of what happens in Washington's own calculations. And the question of what Canada got from Washington remained, deliberately and carefully, unanswered. That unanswered quality is the strategy. Carney has understood something about the current moment that not all of his counterparts have fully absorbed. The United States under this administration is not a reliable anchor for multilateral architecture. Its positions change faster than legal frameworks can be built around them. Its commitments in one season can become liabilities in the next. In that environment, the most valuable thing a middle power can do is build bilateral relationships with other middle powers that are robust enough to hold their shape regardless of what Washington decides on any given week. Germany, India, Japan, the European Union, Australia, South Korea. These are the countries that Carney has been systematically signing agreements with. None of those agreements are as large as the Canadian-American relationship. None of them replace it. But together, they represent something that did not exist 3 years ago. A Canadian foreign policy that has genuine options. The missing bilateral with Trump is part of that architecture. Not because Carney is trying to isolate or antagonize Washington. The careful language, the softened rhetoric, the deliberate avoidance of direct confrontation are all evidence of the opposite intention. But a formal bilateral meeting that produces nothing, or worse, that produces a headline about disagreement over CUSMA terms, is a cost that the current Canadian strategy cannot easily absorb. The alternative, signing agreements with Germany and India on the margins of the same summit, builds something durable without creating the kind of public confrontation that would give the other side a reason to retaliate before Canada's alternative architecture is weight-bearing. The standard has changed. For decades, the G7 was a place where Canada's primary goal was to be seen as a reliable and constructive partner of the United States. The measure of a successful summit was the quality of the bilateral with Washington. That measure has been quietly retired. The new measure, visible in the agreements signed at Evian-les-Bains this week, is how many durable relationships Canada can build with partners who share its interest in a stable, rules-based international order, regardless of whether Washington is currently interested in the same thing. Watch 2 things in the weeks ahead. First, watch whether the CUSMA contradictions from Washington solidify into an actual negotiating position, because the moment they do, the bilateral meeting that did not happen at the G7 will need to happen somewhere. And second, watch what the India GSOIA enables in terms of joint defense and technology initiatives. Because intelligence-sharing frameworks are the scaffolding that more visible cooperation gets built on. The handshakes happened. The paperwork is signed. What comes next will tell you whether this summit's real story was the meeting that did not happen or the 3 that did. The G7 produced a great deal of noise about American positions on trade and on the future of the Western alliance. Canada produced 3 signed agreements, a sanctions package, and a studied absence from the most unpredictable bilateral meeting on the schedule. One of those approaches generates headlines. The other builds leverage. And in a period when the headline can reverse itself before the ink dries on the communiqué, leverage is the more durable currency. If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next.